blind, drunk, and off to war. It is a catastrophic mess tonight in Russia. Vladimir Putin's so-called, or his SOS, for more troops did not get the response that he was hoping for. Videos instead are showing drunken recruits brawling and stumbling and passing out as military commanders desperately try to corral them all onto buses and planes. Yeah, those are drunks, and they're fighting. And those men are supposed to be headed for training, although some reports say they will get none before heading to the meat grinder that is the battlefield in Ukraine. Just days after thousands of Russians learned that they were being called up to fight Putin's losing war, and the true reality of what that means set in, we have seen more and more videos of would-be soldiers drinking themselves senseless before training. Blackout drunk, blind drunk, dead drunk, because death is what these men are expecting. In an interview last week, Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said Russia was immediately calling up 300,000 reservists to, quote, hold the line at the front. Yes, immediately sent to the front. And that's the part that worries the recruits and the people on the outside looking in. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense and other experts who are observing all of this say that most of the new recruits will likely get, quote, little meaningful training and, quote, face high rates of attrition. Attrition. That basically means they will act as human shields for the other troops. And even more troubling, Putin may be putting an extra layer of human suffering in front of the human shield. Reports are emerging that the Russian military may be targeting specific minority groups to walk into the meat grinder first. Russia's home to more than 160 different ethnic and indigenous minorities, and they make up about 20% of that country's population. And yet, those minority groups are being sent to fight at a much higher level than 20%. The communities in Siberia, with close cultural and historic ties with Mongolia, as well as those towns in Dagestan, which are mostly Muslim, those places have reported intensely high recruitment drives. Lots of them going off to fight. In fact, Putin is so desperate to find Russians willing to die for him that he has even accidentally tried to recruit some Russians who are already dead. Several reports have Russian soldiers showing up at homes to arrest draft dodgers, only to learn why they're draft dodgers. The men they're looking for had already died, including one 40-year-old man who died from COVID nearly 2 years ago. This chaotic conscription has a lot of Russians on edge, and we are starting to see the effects of it. One Russian man opened fire inside an army office, seriously wounding a recruitment officer in Siberia. The suspect's mother told the New York Times that her son was distraught, that his friend had been called up with exactly 0 military training, something that Putin had promised would not happen. And then there's another pressure weighing heavily on the minds of Russian men tonight, the mass exodus ban. A ban on leaving that country. It could go into effect at any moment. Here's what it means. As soon as Putin announced he was calling up more troops, hundreds of thousands of Russian men and their families took off. They flooded the Russian border, desperate to get out. Right now, people are waiting in line at the airports for hours upon end. Lines of cars span tens of miles at some land crossings. People are waiting at the Georgian land border for up to 2 days to get across. Some men have taken to bringing scooters to the land borders just so they can weave in and out of the cars to get to the border faster and then out of the country sooner. But all that ends soon, and because they're so far ahead in time from us, it may have already ended. It is rumored that Russia is going to close those borders to military-aged men as soon as tomorrow. So many of those men who are waiting in line may now be forced to turn around and walk straight into the arms of the Russian draft. Question is, Will all of these setbacks with Putin's ground troops prove that his war in Ukraine is a lost cause? And will he eventually capitulate and retreat? Or is a desperate Putin backed into a corner with full nuclear capabilities the most dangerous person on the planet? I'm joined now by Ian Kelly. He was the U.S. ambassador to the former Soviet country of Georgia, as well as the former director of Russian affairs and the former spokesman for the U.S. State Department. Laura Ballman is a national security expert and former CIA operations officer who ran a counterintelligence division for the U.S. Department of Energy. And Jonathan Sanders is a former longtime Moscow correspondent for CBS News and a journalism professor at Stony Brook University. His latest book is called The Russians Emerge. So, Ambassador Kelly, if I may begin with you, all of the reports suggest that Vladimir Putin is backed into a corner at this point. And the big question is, what does a man like that do when in a corner? And is there any hope at all for any kind of diplomatic resolution to this ugliness?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think that he is a desperate man right now. I think that the actions that he's taken, this call up, which has been terribly handled, as you have said, these are all the actions of somebody who really is desperate to try and get out of this. I don't think there's really any diplomatic resolution in sight, because one of the parties to the conflict, the Ukrainians, have said that they're really not interested at this point in a diplomatic solution. I think in terms of Putin trying to get a way out, I think he's already trying to do that by defining downwards the aims of this war, from a total destruction of the Ukrainian army and the installation of a pro-Russian government, down to defending eastern Ukraine, the Donbass area. So I don't see him capitulating, because I think he knows that that means the end of him. But I do think that he's
that's scary. Because, you know, clearly he's been saber rattling with nuclear sabers lately. So that's really distressing to hear someone, you know, in the diplomatic community, as you've been, to say that there doesn't look to be like any hope before that. But Laura, as a CIA officer, what don't I know? Like, because I just listed a very long intro of all the things we do know: drunk soldiers, long miles and miles of lines at the border, you know, conscription that means no training, just off you go to the meat grinder and be the cannon fodder. But what don't I know? What don't all of us know?
Well, you know, we're seeing this snapshot of the results of the profound pain and suffering Russians experience living under Vladimir Putin. One of the things we don't know is, are these just spontaneous uprisings, and or are they becoming, or are they already organized? Remember, Russians have staged 3 revolutions in less than 100 years, you know, 1905, 1917, and the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, you know, are we seeing a tipping point? That's something we don't know, and something I hope, and I'm sure, the intelligence community is watching.
So, Jonathan, weigh in on this, because over the weekend I was reminded of a term that I'd forgotten. It's called a vertical of power. And a vertical of power, when you talk about Vladimir Putin, is basically a stick, and he's at the top. So we have a lot of angry people. We have a public that is clearly not on Putin's side, running for the hills, not prepared to lay their lives down for this man or this war. But how do you tip, as Laura says, the vertical of power when there's no one around him? It's just him. He's literally one man calling all the shots.
Actually, that vertical of power also means the men directly underneath him who are beholden to him, and they're beginning to take some victimhood. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Mr. Putin, came out today and apologized, saying there'd been some mistakes made in the call-up, but he blamed it all on the regional authorities, who they're giving all the responsibility for this. A dissident, the Navalny team, one of the men in prison, but his team today disclosed that the man in charge of KGB successor office for supervising, keeping dissidents in line and stopping domestic actions, owns more than $1 billion of illicit property. We're finding that in places like Makhachkala in Dagestan, that's a pretty spontaneous demonstration. Those people are angry. Chechnya has said they've sent enough troops and they're not going to send any troops. And the Chechen leader is, I call him Thugovich, the thug, son of the son of a thug, and he's one of Mr. Putin's toughest guys. So people are getting antsy and angry. And oh yes, Ashleigh, Novy Gazeta Europa today, or the yesterday, came out with a piece of information saying that there's a secret codicil to the announcement that Mr. Shoigu, the defense minister, who doesn't know anything about defense, issued, saying that they're authorized to call 1 million men up. So, Ashleigh, if you and I want to make some money, we should fly into the border of Georgia and Russia with, let's say, 5,000 bicycles and sell them, because people are abandoning their cars and taking bicycles to get to the head of the line.
Yeah, and they'll start, going over the rough spots of the border at some point soon, too, especially if this ban is already in effect or shortly will go into effect of those men being able to leave at all. So, Ambassador Kelly, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said just in the last couple of days that, in fact, I think it was just yesterday, that there'd been this private high-level series of talks with the Russians, the Americans with the Russians. Kind of floored me to hear that. But I heard him say today, the only thing he would say is that they assured the Russians that consequences would be catastrophic. Those are his words, consequences would be catastrophic. And that he left no scintilla of doubt in the Russians' mind as to what that meant. So my question for you is, what does that mean? Like, what does it practically mean when he says those things?
Well, I took actually a lot of encouragement at what he said by saying that we've conveyed to them with not a scintilla of doubt exactly what the catastrophic consequences would be. I took from that it was a message that was delivered, not so much talks. I don't think we've had talks at least on a senior level since the war began, but. This is exactly what we have to do. We have to put down in black and white, deliver a message that this is what you're looking at. If you follow through with this irresponsible rhetoric of waving nuclear weapons around, this is what's going to happen. And so I think the administration did exactly what had to be done.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? This is what's going to happen is the line that bothers me, because I've always grown up knowing about mutually assured destruction. So the whole this is what's going to happen means it's just going to happen right back at us. So I still don't practically understand what kind of threat the National Security Advisor was talking about with regard to consequences. Like, really practically speaking in diplomatic language. You've been in those meetings. What do you say? Or are we on such, in such uncharted waters with Putin? It's just kind of just rattle the sabers back?
Well, I think, I feel fairly confident that we did not lay out that we would have a tit for tat, that we would respond with nuclear weapons to any use of nuclear weapons. I do think that there are many other things that we can do that would be below the nuclear threshold that would cause tremendous damage to the
like
Russian
what? That's what I'm fascinated in, because we've been, sanctioning them like crazy, and still the meat grinder goes on and on. So what are you talking about?
Well, they've been very careful not to say exactly what it is, but there are things that we can do to really damage their economy, outside of financial sanctions. Something a little more kinetic, say. There are lots of things that we can do that would not be a nuclear response that would still.
Okay, Jonathan, take me there. I saw you put your finger up. Tell me what that kinetic stuff is.
Look, first of all, my old friend Ian is exactly right about kinetic, and we know that their weak point is that they are really dependent on being a gas state. Today's demonstration by NASA of how precisely we could land a little satellite to crash into something 11 bazillion miles away and only have an error of like 24 feet gives them pause. Gives a lot of pause. And, you know, things go bump in the night. They've seen what we've done in Iraq. They've seen what the Israelis have done to Hezbollah on Air Force bases inside Syrian territory. They're not dumb. And by the way, Ashleigh, you did note that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, was in New York last week, and he didn't just come to go shopping for his kids.
Although they do that a lot. One last comment, Laura. I just wanted to ask you, there was a school shooting this is such a weird story, right? Because we're used to it in the U.S. We are not used to seeing a school shooting in Russia. 17 people killed, and the shooter allegedly, reportedly, had some sort of neo-Nazi emblems on his T-shirt. And this is in Russia, and I'm trying to put it all together and come up with is there some there, or is this just a one-off awful story that Russia's also dealing with?
I don't know any of the details about this particular investigation. I agree with Ambassador Kelly that we're in a better situation if all parties are clear about what the consequences will be to certain actions. So this is what we're seeing in the school shooting is an emblematic of the chaos that not only the government is feeling right now, but that the people are feeling in Russia. And going back to what Ambassador Kelly said, I would suspect that in addition to energy, economic sanctions, that if, God forbid, Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, I certainly don't see them using a strategic nuclear weapon. The United States and allies, one would presume, would unleash a massive conventional response. We're not going to unleash a B-61, or that are staged in Europe, or go the strategic route because mutually assured destruction is in play. There are a lot of red flags and a lot of to look for right now, and the red line would definitely be a tactical weapon, nuclear weapon.
Laura Ballman, I always love having you on. Ambassador Ian Kelly, what a treat. I hope you'll come back. And of course, Jonathan Sanders, you're now like one of my best friends. We're on every night together, but this story's not going away. So let's continue this conversation, shall we?
Good to see you, Ashleigh. Ian, be well.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.